It was a quiet morning. The sun streamed through the window, casting a soft, golden glow across the room. A gentle breeze rustled the curtains, and the only sounds in the house were the steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft breath of Sarah, the protagonist's disabled daughter. She lay in her bed, an oxygen tube attached to her nose, keeping her alive, her fragile yet determined existence held together by this lifeline. The family had learned to live in the constant shadow of Sarah's condition, adjusting to the routines that kept her stable. Her mother, Laura, would check the tube every hour, adjusting it if it slipped, making sure it was always delivering the oxygen she needed. It was an act of love, a silent promise that no matter how difficult the world became, Sarah would be cared for. But today, something felt different. As Laura looked out the window, she noticed the faint rustle of movement outside, too faint for her to make out at first. But then she saw her, Karen, the HOA Karen. Laura's heart sank. She recognized that look, disdain mingled with a hint of smug satisfaction. Karen was standing across the street, eyes narrowing as she gazed at the oxygen tube hanging from the window. For Karen, it was not a lifeline. It was an eyesore, a violation. Without a word, Karen's eyes locked on the tube, and in a cruel, swift motion, she pulled out a pair of scissors from her bag. Laura froze, unable to process the scene unfolding before her eyes. Karen approached the window, and with a single snip, the oxygen tube fell to the ground, cutting off Sarah's only source of life. No! Laura screamed, running to the window in panic. But it was too late. The damage was done. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's breathing had already begun to slow. Panic gripped Laura as she scrambled to reconnect the tube, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She screamed for her husband, but the words seemed trapped in her throat, swallowed by the enormity of what had just happened. "Sarah, honey, stay with me," she whispered frantically, her voice trembling. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear flickering across her pale face. Her breaths were shallow, and Laura could see the struggle in her daughter's face. "Mom, what happened?" Sarah gasped. The realization hit, like a ton of bricks. Karen had done this. Her obsession with control had reached its breaking point, and now her actions had threatened Sarah's very life. Laura's world, which had been filled with love and the constant challenge of caring for her daughter, now felt like a nightmare. Sarah's father, Mark, rushed into the room, his face pale with horror as he saw the oxygen tube lying useless on the floor. The sight of Sarah struggling to breathe sent him into action, his hands shaking as he fumbled to replace the tube. "This isn't happening," Mark muttered to himself, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. She couldn't. But Karen had done it. Karen, the woman who had already made their lives miserable with petty complaints and petty rules, had taken this one step further. She had crossed the line. Laura's eyes burned with tears, the rage boiling within her. How could she have done this? How could she target a child, her child, with such cruelty? It was no longer about rules. It was about power, about controlling every aspect of their lives. And now they were forced to confront the reality that this woman, this monster, was capable of anything. The phone call to emergency services felt like an eternity. The dispatcher's calm voice barely registered as Laura struggled to hold it together. Sarah was stable again, but not for long. Time was running out. Mark slammed his fist on the table. "This is it. This is the last straw. We can't let her get away with this." Laura nodded, her face set with determination. "We fight. We take her down." They had always thought their quiet neighborhood was safe, a place where they could find peace. But now, with Karen's deliberate cruelty, they were thrust into a battle that would push them to their limits. Their lives had been turned upside down, and there was no going back. Karen had crossed the line, and the family would make sure she paid for it. The days following the incident with the oxygen tube were a blur of hospital visits, late-night vigils, and the never-ending stress of keeping Sarah stable. But the unease that had settled in the family's home was only a small reflection of what was going on in their neighborhood. It all began with the usual HOA, complaints, little things at first. Parking issues, a minor dispute about the height of their lawn, and the music volume at a weekend gathering. Nothing that couldn't be handled. Or so they thought. At first, Laura tried to dismiss the complaints as Karen being her usual difficult self. She had a reputation for nitpicking, for finding problems where there were none. But when the letters started piling up in the mailbox, each one more aggressive than the last, Laura's optimism began to fade. Mark, her husband, had always handled the majority of the interactions with Karen. He'd been calm, collected, trying to placate her with polite explanations and assurances. But with every complaint, Karen's tone became more hostile, more vindictive. And it was clear she wasn't going to stop. It wasn't long before they realized Karen had begun speaking to other neighbors, turning their once friendly community into a battleground. They would hear whispers through the walls, neighbors exchanging knowing looks as Karen rallied support for her cause. The final straw came when Mark was called to the HOA meeting. They had concerns about the family's behavior, about Sarah's medical equipment, and the unsightly oxygen tube. The board members, many of whom were Karen's close allies, didn't even try to mask their disdain. They spoke in low, cutting tones, as if the family's struggles were a matter of personal inconvenience. The meeting ended with a vague promise that the issue would be looked into, but it felt like a warning, a reminder that the family was no longer welcome in this once peaceful community, and Karen's role in this cleaning up of the neighborhood was far from over. A few days later, the confrontation reached a new level. It wasn't a letter this time. It wasn't a subtle complaint. This time, Karen stormed onto the family's property. Laura had just finished feeding Sarah lunch when she saw the shadow of Karen's figure moving through their front yard, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Laura froze. She'd had enough of Karen's games, but there was something about the way she approached today that was different, more menacing, more direct. "What do you want now?" Laura asked, her voice steely with growing frustration. Karen's eyes narrowed. "You need to remove that equipment. It's a health hazard." Laura's heart skipped a beat. "What? The oxygen tube?" she asked incredulously. "What on earth are you talking about?" "It's visible. It's not just an eyesore, it's a liability," Karen snapped, her voice laced with venom. "I've spoken to the HOA about it, and frankly, it's time you start following the rules." Laura's mind raced. Rules? The oxygen tube was not only a necessary medical device, it was the very thing keeping Sarah alive. Yet Karen, with her unwavering sense of entitlement, was treating it like nothing more than an inconvenience. "We're not going to take it down. My daughter needs it to breathe," Laura replied, her voice trembling, but firm. But Karen wasn't finished. "You're making a mockery of this community. You're inviting trouble. And now, I'm going to make sure it stops," she threatened, her eyes blazing with something darker than simple annoyance. Laura's hands clenched into fists. She knew there was no reasoning with Karen. This had stopped being about rules or aesthetics. This was personal. As Karen turned to leave, she shot one final cold remark over her shoulder. "You won't have the luxury of a peaceful life much longer." The door slammed shut behind her, and for the first time, Laura allowed herself to feel the weight of the threat. Karen was no longer content to simply hassle them with petty complaints. Now, she was making it her mission to target their family's most vulnerable aspect, Sarah's condition. Laura paced the room, her mind whirling. Mark was still at work, unaware of Karen's latest attack. Laura needed to act. But what could they do when the very system that should have been protecting them was instead enabling Karen's reign of terror? The family had been pushed to their breaking point. They had tried to stay quiet, to ignore the tension, but Karen was no longer just a nuisance. She was a monster in disguise, wielding her power over them, and they had no choice but to prepare for the battle that was now inevitable. The morning air was crisp as Laura stepped out onto the porch, trying to shake off the lingering weight of the previous days. The oxygen tube was once again hanging out of the window, a lifeline for Sarah, but to Karen, it was an affront to the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Laura barely had time to register the sound of heels clicking on the pavement when Karen appeared, her eyes fixed on the window. That thing needs to come down. Karen's voice was as cold as her glare. It's not just an eyesore, it's a violation of the HOA's rules. Laura froze, her body tensing. It's an oxygen tube for my daughter, Karen. It's a medical necessity. It stays where it is. But Karen wasn't listening. She took a step closer, her eyes scanning the house, almost as if searching for more things to criticize. I don't care what it's for, she snapped, her tone turning venomous. It's hanging there for everyone to see. It's not acceptable. You're breaking the rules, and I'm not going to stand by and watch this community fall apart because of you. The words hit Laura like a slap. The audacity. The cruelty. For a moment, she couldn't find the right words to say. What could she say? This woman, with her unrelenting sense of entitlement, had just belittled her daughter's life-saving equipment, reducing it to a trivial annoyance. I'm not removing it, Laura said finally, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of fury. This is a hospital-grade necessity. My daughter needs it to breathe. You don't get to decide that. Karen's face hardened, her lips curling into a thin, cruel smile. I don't want either one to tell you this, but you're going to have to choose between complying or facing consequences, she said, her words dripping with malice. Karen's eyes locked onto Laura's, daring her to push back. Laura didn't flinch. She stood tall, but her heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing. This wasn't just a simple dispute anymore. It was something darker, something far more sinister. Without another word, Karen turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the driveway as if she had already won. The house felt colder after Karen left, the silence suffocating. Laura couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her. She knew this wasn't the end. Karen had issued a warning, and it was only a matter of time before she acted on it. Later that evening, Mark came home, unaware of the confrontation. Laura recounted the exchange, her voice tinged with frustration and fear. Mark listened intently, his face hardening with anger as he realized the true weight of the threat they were facing. She's not going to stop, is she? Mark asked quietly, his eyes dark with frustration. No, Laura replied, her voice cracking slightly. She's not. And this isn't just about rules anymore. She wants to control everything. She's going to keep pushing until she gets what she wants. The realization hit them both. Karen wasn't just a neighbor with a vendetta. She had power. She had the HOA on her side, and if they didn't act fast, she could ruin everything for them. The warning had been subtle but unmistakable. Abide by the rules or face consequences. Those words kept echoing in Laura's mind. The rules weren't just about keeping the neighborhood neat and tidy. They were about controlling the very essence of their lives, dictating what was acceptable and what wasn't. Mark ran a hand through his hair. We've got to be ready for whatever comes next. She's not going to back down. Laura nodded, her jaw clenched in determination. She wasn't going to let Karen win. Not now, not ever. But as the day wore on and the weight of Karen's threat settled in, Laura couldn't help but feel the walls closing in. This wasn't just a fight about a tube. It was a fight for their home, their lives, and their dignity. The battle lines were drawn, and in the quiet, cold night, the family braced themselves for what was to come. They had no choice now but to face Karen's growing power head-on. The sun had barely begun to set as Mark sat across the long, polished table in the HOA boardroom, his hands clenched into tight fists beneath the surface. The room felt colder than it should, sterile, filled with the scent of polished wood and stale authority. He had hoped that by appealing directly to the board, they could finally put an end to Karen's reign of terror. But with each passing second, his hope seemed to slip further away. The board members sat in front of him, their faces a mixture of indifference and concealed disdain. Most of them were silent, casting glances at one another, as if awaiting the inevitable. Karen was, as usual, seated to the side, her lips curved into a satisfied smirk, confident in the hold she had over the situation. Mark cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. We're not asking for special treatment. We're simply asking that the HOA reconsider its position regarding the oxygen tube. It's a medical necessity. It's not a decoration. My daughter's life depends on it. But the room remained unmoved. Mrs. Daniels, the HOA president, was the first to speak. Her voice was thin and clipped, dripping with a condescending tone. Mr. Thompson, we understand your concerns, but the rules are clear. Aesthetic standards must be upheld. The presence of such a contraption in plain view is against community guidelines. Mark's heart sank. He had expected some resistance, but this was beyond the pale. This is about my daughter's health. She needs that tube to breathe. The rule is ridiculous and cruel. His voice wavered, but he pushed forward, desperate. Are you really going to let someone like Karen dictate what's acceptable? This is inhumane. Karen, who had remained quiet until now, leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom. You can't expect to break the rules without facing consequences. The community has certain standards, Mr. Thompson. If you can't abide by them, perhaps you're not suited to live here. Every word felt like a jab, an attack not just on the family's home, but on their very right to live with dignity. Karen had turned their life into a battleground, using the HOA as her weapon, and it was clear the board was backing her up. The other members remained silent, avoiding eye contact with Mark, as if complicit in the silence. Mark's voice faltered. This isn't about rules anymore. It's about cruelty. What kind of people are you to allow this? But Karen, with a self-satisfied smile, stood and addressed the room. Perhaps it's time to remind Mr. Thompson that we are all bound by these rules. There's no exception for you, no matter how much you cry foul. If you continue with this behavior, we'll have no choice but to escalate this matter to the next level. The board members nodded in agreement, their lack of empathy stark and unyielding. Mark's heart dropped into his stomach. He knew the battle wasn't over, but it felt as though the walls were closing in, suffocating him in the system that should have been protecting him. By the time Mark returned home, the weight of the meeting pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. Laura stood at the door, her face etched with concern. How did it go? Mark didn't answer immediately. His shoulders sagged as he entered the living room, collapsing onto the couch. It's over. They're with her. Karen's got them wrapped around her finger. The board's not going to lift a finger to help us. Laura's breath caught in her throat. So we've lost? Not yet, Mark said, his voice tight with frustration. But it sure feels like it. She's got the board in her pocket. I don't know what we're supposed to do now. As the day wore on, the family realized just how deep Karen's influence ran. The next few days were filled with an onslaught of complaints about the lawn, the garbage cans, the noise levels, and even the colors of the curtains that were visible through their windows. Each complaint felt like another targeted blow, another way to drive them out of the community. And it wasn't just the HOA anymore. Neighbors who had once been friendly now avoided eye contact, crossing the street when they saw the Thompsons. Laura could feel the shift. She was no longer seen as a mother trying to protect her child. Instead, she was the troublemaker, the one who dared to stand up to Karen's version of order. They were under attack in ways they had never anticipated. Every aspect of their lives, once private and secure, was now subject to scrutiny. Even Sarah's medical condition, something so personal, became a point of ridicule and judgment. Laura felt her heart break every time someone whispered as she passed by. It became clear Karen wasn't just trying to make their lives miserable. She was waging a full-fledged campaign against them. And the worst part, the community, the very place they had thought of as home, had become a battleground, with Karen pulling all the strings from the shadows. The Thompsons were trapped in their own home, suffocated by the weight of Karen's influence and the relentless pressure from the HOA. Every move they made, every step they took, seemed to invite more conflict, more complaints. They couldn't escape. Karen's reach was everywhere. Laura sat beside Mark that night, the two of them silent for a long time. I don't know how much more I can take, she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark squeezed her hand. We won't let her break us. We'll find a way to fight back. But in the quiet, dark house, surrounded by the invisible walls Karen had erected, it was hard to imagine how they could ever escape her grip. The day had started like any other, quiet routine. Sarah was resting in her room, the soft whir of the oxygen machine filling the space as her mother, Laura, moved through the house, tending to her usual duties. Mark was at work, the house still and calm, a rare moment of peace. But the serenity was shattered when the sound of sharp footsteps outside their home broke through the stillness. Laura turned from the kitchen counter and peered out the window. There she was, Karen, standing across the street, glaring at the oxygen tube once more. This time, however, Laura didn't feel the usual sting of irritation. No, this time, a cold, sinking fear crawled up her spine. Something felt wrong. Karen stood there, staring at the tube hanging from Sarah's window, her face twisted with disgust. It wasn't the usual sneer or passive-aggressive comment. No, this was different. Laura's heart began to race as she watched Karen approach the window, her expression dark and determined. "Karen, don't you dare!" Laura shouted, her voice raw with panic. But Karen didn't seem to hear. With deliberate precision, Karen reached into her bag, pulled out a pair of scissors, and before Laura could move, she cut the oxygen tube in one swift motion. The tube fell to the ground like a discarded piece of trash, severing the lifeline between Sarah and the oxygen that kept her alive. "No!" Laura screamed, throwing open the door and rushing toward Sarah's room. She burst into the room just in time to see Sarah's breathing grow labored, her chest heaving in desperate, shallow breaths. "Sarah, baby, stay with me." Laura cried out, trying to reconnect the oxygen tube. But her hands were trembling, the panic overwhelming her. The tube was frayed at the end where it had been severed. The oxygen machine hummed in a hollow, empty rhythm, mocking the dire situation. Sarah's face turned pale, her lips tinged blue, and the fear in her eyes was unbearable. "Mom, I can't breathe." She gasped. Laura's mind raced. She needed help, right now. But she was too far gone in the panic to think clearly. She looked around the room, frantically searching for any way to stop the suffocating silence that had fallen over Sarah's body. The realization hit her like a cold slap. Karen had gone too far. This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't about rules or control. This was about Sarah's life. Tears blurred Laura's vision as she dialed the emergency number. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the phone. "Help us, please. My daughter, she can't breathe. She's choking, the oxygen tube was cut. Please help." The operator's calm voice tried to reassure her, but it did little to stem the tide of panic that was rising within her. "Ma'am, stay calm. Help is on the way. Just keep her breathing steady until paramedics arrive." Steady? How could she stay steady? The seconds were ticking by, each one feeling like an eternity. Sarah's breathing grew weaker with every passing moment, and Laura could feel the weight of helplessness pressing down on her chest. She tried to keep her voice steady for Sarah, but it was nearly impossible. "Mom, I'm scared," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know, sweetheart, I know," Laura whispered back, her own voice breaking. "Just hang on. Help's coming. You have to hold on. Please." But as the seconds stretched on, it became more and more clear that help was taking too long. The oxygen machine was useless now, and the tube, cut, severed, and broken, was beyond repair. Laura couldn't help but feel a wave of helplessness wash over her, an emotion she had never before allowed herself to experience. She had always fought for Sarah's well-being, always found a way to protect her. But now, in this moment, there was nothing she could do. Suddenly, she heard the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside. The paramedics had arrived. "She's in here." Laura screamed, rushing to the door to meet them. Two paramedics rushed in, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. One quickly attached a new oxygen tank to Sarah's face, and the other began checking her vitals. The room was filled with tension, the air thick with urgency as they worked to stabilize her. "She's going to be okay, ma'am," one of the paramedics said, his voice comforting but serious. "We've got her oxygen back on, but she'll need to be monitored closely." Laura felt her knees weaken as she slumped against the wall, her breath ragged with relief. But the relief was short-lived. Karen had taken it too far. What had started as a petty fight over neighborhood rules had escalated into an attack on her daughter's life. Laura looked at Sarah, still fragile and pale in the bed, the color slowly returning to her cheeks, and realized the depth of Karen's malice. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the paramedics continued their work, Laura's mind was already racing ahead. She knew that Karen wouldn't stop here. She had made her move, and now Laura would make hers. No more running. No more hiding. They were done being victims in their own home. They would fight back, no matter what it took. The family's world had shattered. Karen had crossed every line, attacking not only their home and their peace, but their very right to exist without fear. But now, the Thompsons were determined to fight back. They weren't going to let her win. Laura paced the living room, her fingers trembling as she dialed the phone number of the lawyer they had hired. It felt like the last step in a long, drawn-out process of disbelief, but now they had no choice. They had to make a stand, for Sarah, for themselves, for the life they once had. Their lawyer, Peter Harris, was a seasoned professional, a man who had handled complex cases in the past. However, even he had doubts. When Mark had first approached him, Peter's face had been calm, but the moment he learned Karen's full role in the HOA, his demeanor shifted. He wasn't intimidated easily, but there was something unsettling about Karen's power in the community. "Look, I'm going to do everything I can to help you," Peter had said, his voice steady but heavy with an underlying sense of caution. "But understand, this won't be easy. Karen has connections in high places, and the HOA board is practically in her pocket. We're going up against a lot more than just her personal vendetta." Laura's heart sank as she heard the words, but she wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when Sarah's life had been put in jeopardy by a woman who cared more about petty rules than the well-being of others. As the days passed, their lawyer began working on their case, gathering evidence of Karen's abuse of power and her history of complaints against the Thompsons. But every move felt like running into a brick wall. The HOA board was either ignoring them or stonewalling their requests. Every official complaint was met with silence. Every attempt to rally neighbors in their support was either shut down or twisted by Karen's manipulations. The weight of the situation began to settle on Mark and Laura. They had spent days in endless meetings collecting documents and making phone calls to anyone who could help. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the odds were stacked against them. They weren't just fighting Karen. They were fighting a system that had been corrupted by her influence. As the weeks went on, Laura found herself staring out the window late at night, wondering if they were even doing the right thing. The emotional toll was wearing on them both. Every time they went to bed, it felt like they were walking further into a dark tunnel, unsure if they would ever see the light at the end. Mark's sleepless nights were filled with frustration, his fists clenched at his sides as he scrolled through the endless emails and legal papers. Each rejection, each time the HOA refused to acknowledge the situation, chipped away at his resolve. What if we can't win this? Laura's voice broke through the silence one evening, her face pale with exhaustion. What if Karen's power is just too much for us to fight? Mark didn't have an answer, but the doubt in his eyes mirrored hers. They had already been through so much. Their peace had been shattered, their daughter's life threatened, and now even their fight for justice seemed to be slipping away from them. But then Sarah, who had been quiet and withdrawn through the chaos, spoke up. Her voice, though weak, was filled with something strong determination. "I want her to pay, Mom. She hurt me. I want her to know she can't just get away with it." Laura swallowed hard, her heart swelling with pride and pain at the same time. Her daughter, fragile but fierce, was showing a strength that Laura hadn't known she had. Sarah's words reignited something within Laura. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle, it was about showing Sarah that they wouldn't let Karen's cruelty define them. It was about standing tall in the face of fear and injustice. The Thompsons couldn't afford to lose. They couldn't afford to let Karen destroy everything they had fought for. With renewed determination, Laura took Mark's hand. "We keep going. We'll find a way. For Sarah. For us." Mark nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. We fight until the end. We don't let her win. In that moment, the Thompsons realized that while the battle was far from over, they would never give up. No matter how many doors were closed, no matter how many people turned their backs, they would keep pushing forward. They were fighting for more than just a case. They were fighting for their dignity, for justice, and for the safety of their family. And so, despite the doubts, despite the obstacles, they held onto one truth. This fight was far from over, and they were going to make sure that Karen's reign of terror came to an end, no matter the cost. The Thompsons had been living in a fog of frustration, but now they knew it was time to take action. The lawyer had advised them to start gathering evidence, anything that could serve as proof of Karen's relentless harassment and abuse of power. But as Laura and Mark began to reach out to neighbors, they quickly realized the daunting reality of the situation. One by one, they visited homes in the community, knocking on doors, hoping for some kind of support. But each interaction was more disheartening than the last. Neighbors who had once been friendly now avoided eye contact. A few acknowledged the issue, but when it came time to step forward, their courage faltered. "I'm sorry, but I really can't get involved," said one neighbor, Mr. Jacobs, a retired teacher who had known the Thompsons for years. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, as if afraid someone might be listening. "Karen, she's got a lot of influence around here. People don't want to get on her bad side. It's just not worth the trouble." Laura's heart sank. She had hoped for more, expected people to do what was right, but instead, it felt like Karen had built a web of fear around the neighborhood. Fear that kept everyone silent. "We've been living in this community for years," Mark said, his voice tinged with frustration. "We've helped each other, shared meals, celebrated birthdays. And now no one will stand with us?" Mr. Jacobs looked down, his face tight with unease. "It's not that we don't care. But Karen, well, she's good at getting people on her side. You don't want to see what happens to those who cross her." The conversation ended there. No one wanted to speak up. Everyone was afraid. Later that evening, Mark and Laura sat in the living room, the weight of their failure heavy in the air. They had spent the entire day trying to convince their neighbors to speak out, but it seemed hopeless. Even though they had the truth on their side, no one was willing to risk getting caught in Karen's crosshairs. "We need to do something else," Laura muttered, frustration boiling over. "We can't let her control everyone. There's got to be someone who will help us." Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. "We'll keep digging. We can't give up." The next day, as the Thompsons prepared to resume their search for evidence, something unexpected happened. They received a call, a tip-off from an unlikely source. "Is this Laura Thompson?" A voice asked, calm but serious. "Yes, this is she. Who's calling?" "My name's Rachel Martin. I live 2 streets over, and I know about what's been happening with Karen. I think I have some information that could help you." Laura's heart skipped a beat. "What do you know? Is it about Karen?" "Yeah, it's about her," Rachel said, her voice lowering. "Listen, I don't want to get involved in this directly, but I can't stand by and watch her destroy people's lives anymore. Karen has a past, she's done this before. And not just with you." Rachel explained that she had lived in the neighborhood for several years, and while she had always kept a low profile, she had heard whispers about Karen's earlier conflicts with previous residents. "People are afraid to talk about it. But when I was younger, I remember hearing about a woman Karen had a run-in with. She was a single mom, just like you. Karen made her life a living hell. Pushed her out of the neighborhood, got her kicked out of her job, ruined her reputation." Rachel's words hit Laura like a punch to the stomach. "But why is this just coming out now?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because no one wants to speak up," Rachel replied, bitterness in her tone. "Karen's done a lot of damage. And she's clever, she manipulates people, gets them to turn against each other. But I remember that woman Karen targeted. Her name was Claire, and she's still living in the area. Last I heard, she's working at a diner on the edge of town." Rachel's revelation sent a jolt of hope through Laura's veins. This was it, the break they had been waiting for. Finally, they had something substantial to use against Karen. They had to find Claire. She could be the key to bringing Karen's history into the light, and proving that this wasn't an isolated incident. Laura immediately thanked Rachel and hung up the phone, her mind racing with possibilities. "Mark, you won't believe this," she said, her voice shaking with excitement. "We have a lead. There's a woman, Claire. She's been through what we're going through, and she knows what Karen is capable of." Mark's eyes widened with disbelief. Claire, she could be the one who can help us take Karen down. They both knew that this breakthrough, this one piece of hidden truth, was their opportunity to turn the tables. With Claire's testimony, they could finally expose Karen for who she truly was. They weren't alone anymore. There were people who had been through the same nightmare, and together they could fight back. With renewed determination, Laura and Mark prepared to find Claire, ready to face the truth that had been buried for so long. They were one step closer to taking down Karen, and no amount of fear could stop them now. The moment had come. After weeks of planning, gathering evidence, and working tirelessly to uncover Karen's true nature, the Thompsons finally had what they needed. They weren't just facing off with a petty neighbor anymore. They were about to expose a woman whose reach extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. And for the first time in weeks, Mark and Laura felt like they were in control. Sitting at the kitchen table, Laura spread the documents out in front of her. Photos, testimonies, police reports, and evidence from Claire, all pointing to Karen's manipulative and cruel behavior. This wasn't just a fight over a neighborhood rule. This was about a pattern of abuse, lies, and control that spanned years. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Mark asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the papers one more time. Laura nodded, her eyes steady with determination. "We have to be. She's used the HOA to hurt people, ruin lives. It ends today. She's not going to get away with this anymore." The plan was simple: confront Karen, show her the evidence, and force her to admit what she had done. If she didn't back down, they would take the fight to court. But Laura knew that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. She'd never been one to admit defeat easily. The tension in the house was palpable as they prepared to face her. They knew Karen wouldn't just apologize or back off quietly. This confrontation was inevitable, and they had to be ready for whatever came next. The knock on the door was sharp, urgent. It was Karen. Mark opened the door slowly, his face calm but resolute. "Karen, we need to talk." Karen, as usual, stood tall, her posture rigid and superior. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a small crack in her usual armor. She had no idea what they had been preparing. "What's this about?" Karen's voice was cold, her arms crossed over her chest in a defensive stance. "We've gathered some evidence," Laura said, her voice steady, "about your history of targeting families in this neighborhood. We're not going to let you continue with this." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You don't have anything on me. This is a waste of time." Laura stepped forward, holding up the stack of documents, photographs, and the witness statement from Claire. "You're wrong. We have everything we need." For a moment, Karen didn't speak. She glanced at the papers, her expression shifting from arrogance to something darker, more calculating. She wasn't afraid. "Not yet. You think this will stop me?" she finally said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. I've done nothing wrong. People like you, weak people, always think they can control everything. But you can't. Not in my world. Not here." Laura's breath caught in her throat. She had known Karen was manipulative, but to hear her speak so openly, so venomously was a shock. This wasn't just a neighbor who wanted control over trivial things. This was a woman whose hunger for power had destroyed lives. "You have destroyed lives, Karen," Mark said, his voice gaining strength. "You've used your position to hurt people, to hurt our daughter, and we're not going to let you get away with it anymore." Karen's smile was chilling. "You think you can stop me? You think people will side with you? You're outnumbered. I'll make sure this ends badly for both of you." But the Thompsons were resolute. They were no longer just trying to protect their daughter. They were fighting for their dignity, for their right to live in peace. And Karen wasn't going to take that from them. "You're done, Karen," Laura said firmly. "You're not in control anymore. We're going to make sure of that." As Karen turned and stormed away, her final threat hanging in the air, the Thompsons stood in silence. For the first time, They felt the full weight of what they had just done. They had confronted Karen with everything they had, and for a brief moment, they had glimpsed the true depth of her malice. But now they had to decide, how far would they go to protect their family? Mark and Laura stood in the living room, the reality of their situation sinking in. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a battle for their lives, their peace, their future. "We've done it," Mark said, his voice low, but filled with a mixture of relief and trepidation. "We've exposed her for what she is. But now, what?" Laura closed her eyes, her mind spinning with possibilities. They had the evidence, they had the witnesses, but the fear was still there. The fear of what Karen might do next. If they pushed too hard, if they went too far, what would happen? Would Karen retaliate? Would she find a way to destroy them, just as she had destroyed others before them? "This isn't just about justice anymore," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about survival. If we don't keep pushing, we'll never be safe. She'll just keep going, ruining more lives." Mark looked at her, his eyes dark with the weight of the decision. "But how far are we willing to go? What if this changes everything? What if we risk losing everything to stop her?" It was a question Laura had been asking herself. The stakes had never been higher, but she knew that they couldn't back down. They couldn't let Karen win. "Not now. We go all the way," Laura said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "We finish this. For Sarah. For all of us." Mark nodded, a grim smile crossing his face. "For Sarah." And with that, they knew there was no turning back. They had made the decision. The fight for their family's future had just begun, and they were ready for whatever came next. The air was thick with tension as Laura and Mark stood outside Karen's home. It was the culmination of everything they had fought for, their daughter's life, their dignity, their future. They had gathered the evidence, they had shown Karen's manipulations, but now it was time for the final battle. They weren't going to back down. They couldn't. Karen's house loomed ahead, its well-manicured yard a perfect picture of the perfection she so desperately sought to impose on others. It was a facade, a false image of control and power. But behind that pristine front was the real Karen, the one who used that power to break others. Mark took a deep breath, his hand resting on the papers they had filed with the court, ready for their final stand. "Are we ready for this?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with a nervous energy. Laura's eyes locked onto the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. "We have no choice. We've come this far. It's time to end this." The moment they had been dreading and yet longing for was finally here. With a final glance at each other, they marched up the front steps and rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a signal that this time it was different. When Karen opened the door, her face lit up with that familiar, smug smile. But there was something in her eyes, something darker, more menacing, as though she knew this confrontation wasn't going to go the way she had planned. "Laura, Mark," Karen said, her tone dripping with feigned politeness. "What can I do for you today?" Laura didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You know exactly why we're here." Karen raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting. "Oh, really? I thought we'd already gone through all of this." "No," Mark said, his voice sharp. "You've gone too far. You've crossed a line. This isn't just about the oxygen tube anymore. It's about the damage you've done to this family and countless others." Karen stepped aside, ushering them into the foyer. "Come on in then. Let's talk." But her words were empty. She wasn't interested in talking. She wanted to dominate. The Thompsons entered, the weight of the confrontation pressing on them with every step. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. "We have evidence of everything you've done," Laura said, her voice clear and unwavering. "The manipulation, the harassment, the way you've used your position to ruin lives, including ours. This is over, Karen." Karen's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She quickly recovered, a look of cold amusement replacing it. "Is that what you think? You think your little files and documents are going to stop me? I've run this neighborhood for years, Laura. No one will believe you. You're just the latest in a long line of people who tried and failed." Mark's jaw clenched. "We're not like the others, Karen. We won't back down. We've already taken this to court. For the first time, Karen's confident demeanor wavered. What are you talking about? She snapped, her voice rising. We've got witnesses, Laura continued, her eyes never leaving Karen's. Claire, the woman you tried to ruin years ago, she's ready to testify against you. And don't think for a second that the HOA board can protect you now. People know the truth. Karen's face turned pale. The smile that had been plastered across her face vanished entirely, replaced by a mixture of anger and disbelief. You can't do this. You don't know what you're messing with. I have influence, I have power. The board will back me. I've got everything in my control. Not anymore, Mark said, his voice cold. We've taken everything from you. The board will no longer protect you. This is the end, Karen. For a brief moment, Karen stood there, silently seething. Then, with a sharp, almost imperceptible movement, she snapped. You think this is over? She spat, her voice dripping with venom. You think you won? This isn't the end. This is just the beginning. I will make sure you regret this. I'll destroy you both and your little girl too. You'll see. I'll ruin everything. But the Thompsons weren't afraid anymore. They had already faced the worst Karen had to offer, and they had survived. The last shred of fear in Laura's chest disappeared, replaced by a fierce resolve. This isn't about us anymore, she said, her voice steady but firm. This is about stopping you from hurting anyone else. You've ruined lives. You've hurt families. And now it ends. The confrontation was at its peak, and yet there was still an air of uncertainty. Would Karen try to retaliate? Would her power be enough to destroy everything the Thompsons had worked for? Laura and Mark were standing on the edge, knowing that their next steps would decide the outcome once and for all. Karen took a step back, her lips trembling with barely contained fury. She knew her threats were meaningless now. She had lost. The Thompsons had stripped her of her power, and now she had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of the silence was suffocating. Then Mark stepped forward, holding out the stack of legal documents that had been their lifeline. We've exposed you, Karen, he said, his voice calm but final. And we're not going to stop until everyone knows the truth. Karen's gaze flicked to the papers, her eyes narrowing in a last, desperate attempt to maintain control. But it was clear. The game was over. For Laura and Mark, it felt like a victory, a long-fought battle finally won. But there was no celebration. There was only the grim reality of what had transpired. They had faced down a woman who had terrorized their family, who had used her influence to manipulate and harm others. And they had won. But as Karen turned away, defeated, Laura couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't the last time they would hear from her. The damage had been done, but the fight had taken its toll on all of them. Still, they had taken back control. And for the first time in a long time, they could breathe easy. Their fight for justice wasn't over. But this was the moment they had been waiting for. And Karen? She was no longer the one in charge. The morning after the confrontation with Karen, Laura stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the neighborhood. It was quiet. For the first time in months, there was no looming threat of another complaint, no more whispers from neighbors, no more feeling like the walls were closing in. But as she stared out at the empty streets, the weight of everything that had happened hung heavily in the air. The battle had been long and grueling. The fight for their family, for their dignity, had tested them in ways they never imagined. And while they had won, had finally exposed Karen for what she truly was, it had come at a cost. The scars, both physical and emotional, would remain long after the dust had settled. Sarah, though no longer physically in danger, was still struggling with the trauma. It wasn't just the oxygen tube that had been cut off. It was the years of feeling like they didn't belong, of being watched, judged, and harassed. Karen had made their home feel like a battlefield. And while Sarah's body was healing, the emotional wounds would take longer to mend. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring at the papers they had filed with the court, the documents that had sealed their victory. But even as he looked at them, there was no sense of triumph. There was no joy in winning. He had seen too much pain, Too much damage done to feel anything but exhaustion. I never thought it would end like this, Mark said softly, breaking the silence. Laura turned toward him, her eyes heavy with the same weariness. It had to end. But at what cost, Mark? Look at what she did to Sarah. Look at what she did to us. I know, Mark replied, his voice tight with frustration. I don't know if we can ever really put it all behind us. What she did, it changed us. It changed everything. Laura walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. She didn't need to say anything. They both understood the gravity of what they had endured. But despite the weight of the scars, they knew they had survived. And that in itself was a kind of victory. Weeks passed, and slowly the Thompsons began to rebuild. Sarah's physical health improved, but her emotional scars took longer to heal. Laura and Mark both knew that their family would never be the same. The peace they had once known was shattered, and they had been forced to grow stronger in its wake. But they were learning to navigate this new reality step by step. The neighborhood had changed, too. Many of the people who had once sided with Karen now avoided the Thompsons altogether, too ashamed or afraid to offer their support. But some had reached out, offering apologies, offering help. It was a strange, bittersweet feeling. The Thompsons had fought for their peace, but the cost was a distance between them and their community. As for Karen, she had been forced to step down from her position in the HOA. The evidence they had gathered, the testimonies from Claire and others, had been enough to bring her reign of terror to a grinding halt. But Laura knew that Karen's shadow would always loom over them. She was the kind of person who would never truly accept defeat. And in the quiet corners of their minds, they wondered, would she seek revenge? Would she try to rebuild her influence? But for now, Karen's power was broken. For now, the Thompsons could breathe, and though they were scarred, they had found something even more powerful than peace. They had found resilience. Laura sat beside Sarah's bed that night, her daughter asleep after a long day. She watched her, the rise and fall of her chest, and felt a deep, overwhelming love for the girl who had survived so much. They had survived, and that was what mattered. The future was uncertain. They couldn't erase the past, and they couldn't guarantee that Karen wouldn't strike again. But one thing was clear, they had each other. They had fought for their right to live without fear, and they had won. As Laura whispered a quiet promise to Sarah, she knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. They were stronger now, no longer afraid, and that made all the difference. The Thompsons' battle against the oppressive HOA Karen is over, but their story is far from finished. Have you ever faced a similar fight for justice or found yourself standing up against an unjust authority? Share your thoughts, experiences, or support in the comments below. If you're ready to take a stand and fight for what's right, don't wait. Start today. Join the conversation and help spread awareness about the importance of standing up against abuse of power. Together, we can inspire others to speak out, make a change, and fight for a better tomorrow. Remember, the first step to overcoming any challenge is believing that you deserve to win. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to stay updated on new content.